I noticed the glass move before I even took a sip, and in that instant, I knew something was wrong. That thought did not feel dramatic at the time, only quiet, like a small alarm going off in the back of my mind that I could not fully explain. It was my wedding day, the kind of day people are supposed to remember for happiness, laughter, and family coming together. The reception hall in Austin, Texas was glowing with warm golden lights, soft floral arrangements, and the low hum of conversations blending into music that was supposed to feel comforting. Sarah Mitchell, stood near the edge of the main table, holding a drink I barely remembered accepting, my attention drifting between guests and the subtle tension I could not name yet. My husband, Daniel Carter, was speaking with relatives near the dance floor, smiling politely, unaware of the shift I had begun to feel inside the atmosphere. Everything looked perfect from the outside, too perfect almost, like a photograph staged to hide something just beyond the frame. That was when I noticed Jason Mitchell, my brother, moving differently than everyone else. It was supposed to be part of the celebration, but instead he kept appearing and disappearing between tables, always just out of direct attention, always just long enough to avoid being questioned. He had always known Jason as unpredictable, but not like this. Not distant in a way that felt intentional. He did not look at me directly when he passed near the drink station. That detail stayed with me longer than I expected. A few minutes later, I returned to my seat and placed the glass down for a moment. That was when I saw it, the slight difference in position. Not obvious enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to feel uncertain. He did not drink immediately. Instead, I watched the room, watching him more than the celebration itself. Jason stood near the back of the hall now, his posture rigid, his hands too still for someone at a wedding. When his eyes briefly met mine, he looked away too quickly, as if the moment itself was something he had already rehearsed avoiding. I remember thinking that families are supposed to feel familiar, even in silence. This silence felt different. It felt constructed. My thoughts were interrupted when Daniel returned to my side, asking if I was ready for the next toast. Ismail, but I did not drink. Not yet. Something in me had shifted from participation to observation without permission, like my mind had stepped one pace behind reality to study it more carefully. Jason's movements, the glass, the timing of everything began forming a pattern I did not fully understand, but could no longer ignore. And in that moment, standing in the middle of my own wedding surrounded by people celebrating, I realized that some of the most important truths do not arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, in the space between trust and doubt, where you start noticing things you were never meant to question. The moment I stopped drinking from the glass, the atmosphere around me did not change, but my perception of it did. Everything looked the same warm lighting, the same music, the same polite conversations flowing across tables, yet I could no longer experience it in the same way. It felt as if I had stepped slightly outside of my own life and was now watching it from a distance I did not choose. He placed the glass down on the table with care, pretending it was nothing more than a simple pause, but inside I was no longer participating in the moment, only observing it. Daniel returned to my side again, his hand gently touching my back as he leaned in to ask if I was ready for the next toast. He nodded slowly, but my attention was no longer with him. It was elsewhere, locked on the subtle movements of my brother Jason across the room. It was no longer simply moving between guests. It was avoiding fixed positions, never staying in one place long enough to be questioned, never lingering where attention might settle on him. He had known Jason my entire life, but I had never seen him move like this, as if the entire room was something he needed to navigate without being seen. My attention returned briefly to the glass. It sat exactly where I had left it, but now it felt different, like an object that had become part of a question I could not yet fully articulate. He did not accuse anyone. He did not confront anything. Instead, I began doing something I rarely did with my own family. He started remembering patterns instead of emotions. Jason had arrived earlier than most guests. He had not helped with photos or greetings like others in the wedding party. He had spent more time near service tables, near drink stations, near areas where attention was minimal. Each detail on its own meant nothing. Together, they started forming something I could not ignore. Daniel followed my gaze for a moment and then gently guided me back into the social rhythm of the room. Everyone is waiting for the toast, he said softly, unaware of the internal shift happening inside me. He smiled again, the same practiced expression I had used throughout the evening, but I was no longer fully inside it. He moved with him toward the center of the reception area, where glasses were being raised and conversations were beginning to quiet down. Jason was now standing slightly behind the main group, his posture still tense, his attention divided between me and everything else in the room. When our eyes briefly met again, there was something in his expression I had not seen before. Not anger. Not celebration. Something closer to urgency, but controlled, as if even his emotions were being carefully managed. The toast began, voices rising together in polite celebration, and I raised my glass slightly without drinking. That simple decision felt more significant than anything else that had happened so far. He realized then that the moment was no longer about whether something had happened to my drink. It was about whether I was willing to ignore what I had already started to notice. And in that quiet realization, surrounded by applause and celebration that no longer reached me in the same way, I understood that the truth does not always announce itself at once. Some things it builds slowly, through observation, hesitation, and the things people assume you will never question. The applause from the toast faded quickly for me, not because the moment ended, but because I was no longer fully inside it. He stood there holding the glass without drinking, letting the noise of celebration continue around me while my attention remained anchored somewhere else entirely. Jason was still within my line of sight, but now he was no longer simply moving through the crowd. It was positioning himself, subtly adjusting where he stood depending on where I was looking, as if he understood that attention itself could become dangerous if held too long. Daniel leaned slightly toward me again, asking if I was feeling all right, but I answered too quickly, too automatically, and I could tell he noticed something was off even if he did not yet understand what it was. He gave a small smile to reassure him, but my eyes drifted back toward Jason without permission. That was when I noticed something new. It was not just avoiding me. It was avoiding direct sightlines between me and the drink station area. It was a detail so small that most people would dismiss it as coincidence, but I could no longer unsee it once I noticed the pattern. My mind started replaying earlier moments from the evening. Jason arriving earlier than expected. Jason insisting on helping with setup near the beverage table. Jason stepping in and out of view at exactly the points where drinks were being refilled or moved. Each memory on its own felt harmless. Together, they no longer did. I took a slow breath, trying to ground myself in the reality of the room. The wedding continued around me in perfect rhythm, music flowing, chairs shifting, conversations blending into a steady background hum. But now I felt separated from it, as if I had moved behind an invisible barrier where observation replaced participation. He set my glass down again without drinking, a deliberate action that I tried to make appear casual. Daniel followed the movement and gently placed his hand on my arm. "You are very quiet," he said softly. "Is everything all right?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Just tired," I replied, the simplest answer I could give without raising concern. But tired was not the right word. Awareness was more accurate. Jason moved again, this time closer to the edge of the dance floor, where lighting shifted between shadows and warm highlights. He stopped when he realized I was watching him, and for the first time that evening, he did not immediately look away. Instead, he held my gaze for a moment longer than before. Not long enough for others to notice, but long enough for me to understand that he knew I had started paying attention. That realization changed something in the air between us. He was no longer simply a participant in the wedding. He was now part of a silent exchange that no one else had been invited to notice. Daniel gently guided me forward as the music shifted again, encouraging guests to gather for another moment of celebration. He followed, but my attention remained divided, split between the public performance of the wedding and the private pattern I was beginning to recognize underneath it. Jason stayed just outside the main group, never fully entering, never fully leaving. And in that distance, I began to understand something I could not yet fully name. Whatever had been done, or attempted, it was no longer hidden from me. It was only waiting to be confirmed. The moment I stopped trying to blend back into the rhythm of the celebration, everything around me began to feel more distinct, almost sharpened. The music, the laughter, even the movement of guests between tables no longer formed one smooth background. Instead, it separated into individual pieces that my mind could track more clearly. He realized I was no longer experiencing the wedding as a participant. He was analyzing it. Jason had shifted again, now positioned closer to a side table where drinks were being refreshed by staff. It was not speaking to anyone directly, but his attention kept returning to the same small area where glasses were being handled. It was not obvious enough for others to notice, but once I had seen the pattern, it became impossible to ignore. I excused myself briefly from Daniel's side, telling him I needed a moment of fresh air. He nodded without suspicion, still unaware of the internal shift happening inside me. As I walked slowly toward the edge of the reception space, I kept my expression neutral, matching the calm atmosphere of a bride who was simply overwhelmed by attention. But internally, I was no longer calm. He was focused. Jason noticed me moving and adjusted his position almost immediately, turning slightly away as if he wanted to reduce the chance of direct engagement. That reaction confirmed something I had been trying not to assume too quickly. It was aware of my attention. Not in a casual way, but in a controlled way, as if he had anticipated it at some level. He stopped near a floral arrangement at the edge of the main seating area and pretended to observe the decor while actually watching him through the reflection of nearby glass. From this angle, I could see him more clearly without drawing attention. His movements were minimal, but deliberate. He did not approach the center of activity. He stayed within reach of the drink service area, occasionally glancing toward the table where my glass had been refilled earlier. That was when I remembered something I had initially dismissed. Jason had insisted on helping earlier in the evening when drinks were being organized. At the time, it had seemed like an unimportant gesture, something a family member might do at a wedding to be helpful. Now it no longer felt random. He slowly turned my glass in my hand, looking at it without drinking. The surface of the liquid was still, reflecting the warm lights above us. He did not feel immediate fear. What I felt instead was something more structured, like my mind was assembling pieces that finally had permission to connect. Daniel appeared again beside me, asking if I wanted to sit down for a moment. He nodded, accepting without explanation. As we moved toward a quieter table, I kept Jason in my peripheral vision. He did not follow directly, but I noticed he changed his position again, subtly adjusting to maintain awareness of where I was without making it obvious to anyone else. That behavior was no longer something I could dismiss as coincidence. It had pattern. It had intent. He sat down, placing the glass carefully on the table in front of me without taking another sip. Daniel sat beside me, still unaware of the undercurrent forming beneath the celebration. He smiled at me gently, assuming I was simply tired from the long day. He returned a small smile in response, but my attention was elsewhere entirely. Across the room, Jason stood still for a moment longer than usual, then slowly turned away, as if deciding to wait rather than act further in plain sight. And in that moment, I understood that whatever was happening was not finished. It had only reached the point where I was no longer meant to ignore it. The longer I sat there without drinking, the more the wedding around me began to feel like something happening at a distance rather than something I was part of. Conversations continued, glasses were raised, and music flowed through the reception hall in a steady rhythm, but my attention no longer moved with it. It stayed fixed on the small patterns I had started to recognize. Jason was no longer in the same position as before. He had shifted again, now standing closer to a service corridor that connected the main hall to the catering area. From there, he had a clear view of both me and the drink station, without needing to stand in the center of attention. That detail made something inside me tighten, not emotionally, but logically, as if a conclusion was beginning to form without permission. Daniel leaned closer, asking if I wanted to step outside for a few minutes. He hesitated, then nodded, using the opportunity to move without drawing attention to what I was really doing. As we walked slowly toward a quieter section of the venue, I kept my posture relaxed, matching the appearance of a bride simply needing air after a long evening. But my awareness did not relax with my body. Jason noticed the movement immediately. I saw it in the way he adjusted his stance, subtly repositioning himself so that he could still track where I was heading without appearing to follow. That behavior was no longer something I could interpret as coincidence. It was too coordinated, too responsive. We stopped near a side garden entrance where the noise of the reception softened slightly. Daniel spoke gently about how quickly the evening had passed, about how everyone seemed happy, but I only half listened. My focus remained on Jason, who was now partially obscured by guests but still clearly oriented toward my position. It was not approaching. It was observing. Waiting. He looked down at my glass again, still holding it but no longer treating it as part of the celebration. He set it on a nearby table and left it there deliberately. Daniel did not question it. He assumed I simply needed rest. That assumption created a quiet space for me to think more clearly. He began replaying the evening again, but now with structure instead of emotion. Jason arriving early. Jason near the drink station. Jason moving away whenever I looked directly at him. Jason returning to positions that allowed visibility without engagement. Each moment that had once felt isolated now aligned into a pattern that I could not dismiss. My mind was no longer asking whether something had happened. It was asking why. And that question changed everything. Jason appeared again at the edge of the crowd, closer this time, but still careful not to enter my direct space. When our eyes met briefly, he did not look away immediately. Instead, he held the moment just long enough for me to understand that he knew I was no longer simply participating in the wedding. He was watching it differently. Daniel placed a hand lightly on my arm, asking if I was ready to return inside. He nodded again, allowing myself to be guided back, but my attention remained divided. The celebration resumed around us, unchanged in appearance but no longer unified in meaning. Jason remained at a distance, no longer shifting as frequently, as if the uncertainty phase had ended and something more deliberate was now in motion. And in that quiet realization, I understood that the situation was no longer about what I suspected. It was about what was about to be confirmed. The return to the main hall felt different from how I had left it. Nothing had changed on the surface, yet everything felt slightly misaligned, as if I was no longer moving through the same version of the evening as everyone else. Music continued to play, guests continued to laugh, and conversations continued to flow between tables, but I was now aware of something underneath it all that I could not unsee. Jason was no longer actively shifting positions. Instead, he had settled into a fixed point near the far side of the reception space where he could observe both the drink station and my position without drawing attention to himself. That change in behavior felt significant, not because it was dramatic, but because it was controlled. Daniel walked beside me as we re-entered the center of the room, still unaware of the shift forming in my awareness. He spoke casually about the next part of the evening, but I only responded when necessary, keeping my attention divided between him and Jason's stillness. That stillness felt more intentional than any movement had been. He noticed something else then. The staff near the drink station had rotated positions. Frizz drinks were being served again, glasses refilled, trays moved across tables. Yet Jason did not approach that area anymore. It was no longer acting. It was watching. That distinction mattered more than anything else I had noticed so far. He took a slow breath, letting my expression remain calm, matching the appearance of someone fully engaged in their own wedding. But internally, I was no longer matching anything. I was tracking. Daniel paused briefly to greet a guest, and in that moment I shifted slightly to the side, giving myself a clearer line of sight toward Jason. When our eyes met again, there was no longer avoidance on his part. There was recognition. Not spoken, not acknowledged, but clearly present. It was the kind of recognition that did not belong to surprise. It belonged to timing. As if he understood that whatever had been subtle before had now reached a point where it could no longer remain invisible. He did not move away this time. He held his gaze just long enough to confirm what I was beginning to understand. It was no longer trying to hide the pattern. It was measuring it. Daniel returned beside me, gently guiding me back toward our table as the next part of the celebration began. He followed without resistance, but my attention remained anchored elsewhere. The toast resumed, voices rose again in coordinated celebration, and glasses were lifted across the room. He raised mine as well, but I still did not drink. That small decision now felt less like hesitation and more like confirmation. Jason remained where he was, no longer shifting, no longer adjusting. The uncertainty that had defined his movements earlier in the evening had disappeared. In its place was something far more structured. Intent. And as I stood there surrounded by celebration that no longer felt fully connected to me, I realized that whatever had been introduced into this night was no longer a question waiting for an answer. It was already in motion. The moment the toast ended, the room briefly returned to a softer rhythm, but I no longer felt carried by it. He stood with Daniel near our table, still holding the glass without drinking, while my attention remained locked on the far side of the reception hall. Jason had not moved from his position, and that alone now felt more meaningful than anything he had done earlier in the evening. It was not the behavior of someone reacting anymore. It was the behavior of someone waiting for a specific point in time. He noticed how he occasionally shifted his weight, not in nervousness, but in calculation, as if tracking intervals rather than events. The staff continued circulating with trays of drinks, refilling glasses across tables, yet Jason never approached any of them again. That change was too precise to ignore. Daniel leaned toward me again, speaking softly about the next scheduled moment of the evening, but I only half heard him. My mind was no longer moving linearly through the celebration. It was reconstructing it in fragments. Every earlier detail that had seemed disconnected now aligned into something structured. Jason arriving early. Jason near the preparation areas. Jason avoiding direct interaction with me while maintaining visual access. Each moment now pointed in the same direction, though I still did not allow myself to define what that direction meant fully. He only observed. Jason's eyes met mine again from across the room, and this time there was no adjustment, no avoidance. It held the gaze with a controlled stillness that did not belong to confusion. It belonged to readiness. He felt something shift internally, not fear, but confirmation that the dynamic between us had changed permanently. It was no longer operating in uncertainty. It was operating in execution of whatever plan he believed was already set. Daniel gently guided me to sit as the next portion of the reception began transitioning into a quieter phase. Guests were settling, conversations lowering in volume, glasses being placed back onto tables. He followed the motion without resistance, but my attention remained divided in a way that felt irreversible. I watched Jason reposition himself slightly closer to the edge of the hall again, not entering the center, not retreating further, but maintaining a precise boundary where observation remained possible without exposure. That boundary felt intentional. He looked down at my glass again, still untouched, and for the first time I stopped treating that fact as hesitation. It was no longer hesitation. It was information. Daniel continued speaking beside me, unaware of the internal structure forming in my thoughts. He responded when necessary, maintaining appearance, but my awareness stayed fixed on patterns rather than conversation. Jason no longer needed to move frequently. His stillness now communicated more than his earlier movement had. It suggested alignment with a specific moment that had not yet arrived. And as I sat there surrounded by celebration that continued without interruption, I realized something I could no longer dismiss. Whatever had been introduced into this night was not random, and it was not finished. It was simply waiting for the point where it would become undeniable. The atmosphere in the reception hall had begun to shift into its quieter phase, but for me, nothing about it felt calmer. The celebration continued in a softer rhythm now, with fewer voices overlapping and more isolated conversations between guests, yet my internal focus had only sharpened further. He remained seated beside Daniel, holding my glass without drinking, while my attention stayed fixed on Jason across the room. It had not moved for several minutes. That stillness no longer felt like hesitation or uncertainty. It felt like completion of preparation. Daniel leaned slightly toward me again, asking if I wanted to step outside for air, but I shook my head gently. My body remained still, but my awareness was fully active, tracking every small shift in the environment. Jason finally moved again, not toward me, not toward the center of the room, but toward a position that gave him a clear line of sight to both me and the drink stations without crossing into direct attention. That movement confirmed what I had been slowly understanding. It was not reacting to the wedding anymore. It was waiting for a specific moment within it. He looked down at my glass again, still untouched, and for the first time I stopped seeing it as part of celebration at all. It had become part of a structure I was no longer willing to ignore. Daniel placed his hand lightly on my shoulder, unaware of the internal distance growing inside my attention. He responded normally, nodding at something he said, maintaining the appearance expected of me, but my focus remained elsewhere entirely. Jason's eyes met mine again briefly, and this time there was no adjustment in his expression. No avoidance. No hesitation. Just recognition that the moment he was waiting for had not yet arrived, but was close enough to maintain full attention. That realization changed the way I perceived everything around me. Conversations, music, movement of staff, all of it became secondary to timing. He began to understand that the structure I had been sensing was not random behavior but coordinated patience. Whatever had been introduced earlier, whatever intent had been forming beneath the surface of the evening, was not designed to be visible immediately. It was designed to unfold within expectation. Daniel spoke again, mentioning something about the next formal part of the reception, but I only partially registered his words. My attention remained anchored to Jason's position, to the drink service area, to the invisible connections between movement and opportunity. He noticed that staff were beginning to clear certain tables, subtly shifting the environment into its next phase. That transition mattered more than it should have, because Jason adjusted his position in response. Not dramatically, but precisely, as if responding to a signal that only he understood. He felt something settle inside me at that moment, not emotional reaction, but recognition that observation alone was no longer sufficient. Whatever was happening had already moved past suspicion. It was now structure, and structure implied intention. He remained seated, still holding my glass without drinking, while the celebration continued around me in softer tones. Jason remained at a calculated distance, no longer hiding, no longer advancing, only waiting. And in that quiet, controlled stillness, I understood that the night had reached a point where nothing would remain uncertain for much longer. The moment that followed felt different from everything that had come before it, not because something visibly changed in the room, but because I finally understood the shape of what I had been sensing all night. The celebration continued in a softened rhythm, guests slowly transitioning between conversations, chairs shifting, glasses being placed down with less coordination and more ease, as the formal structure of the evening began to dissolve into something more casual. Yet within that transition, I remained fully aware, fully still, holding my glass without drinking, while my attention stayed anchored on Jason. It had moved again, but not randomly. It had positioned himself closer to the central service path, where movement between tables and drink stations naturally intersected. It was not a social position. It was a calculated one. Daniel sat beside me, speaking gently about how the evening was beginning to wind down, but I only nodded without fully processing his words. My focus was no longer on participation. It was on confirmation. Jason's gaze met mine across the room, and this time there was no concealment in his expression. No attempt to appear casual or distracted. It was steady, deliberate, and unmistakably aligned with expectation rather than uncertainty. In that moment, something inside me stopped resisting the structure I had been sensing and instead began to recognize it fully. He set my glass down slowly on the table in front of me, not because I had decided anything yet, but because I was no longer willing to hold it without understanding why it had been important to me not to drink from it. The action was subtle, unnoticed by most, but I felt the shift immediately in the way Jason adjusted his stance. Not toward me, not away from me, but into readiness. Daniel noticed my silence and asked if I wanted to sit somewhere quieter, but I shook my head slightly, keeping my posture composed. Around Boise, guests continued to fade into smaller clusters of conversation, the reception losing its formal rhythm. It was in this gradual loosening of structure that I realized how tightly Jason had been holding his position the entire evening, not reacting to chaos, but waiting for its reduction. That realization changed everything about how I interpreted his behavior. It was not improvising. It was timing. My attention moved briefly to the drink stations again, now less active, with fewer staff circulating. That reduction in movement aligned precisely with Jason's stillness. It did not follow the flow of the event. It followed its transitions. Daniel placed a hand lightly on my back, guiding me subtly as if preparing to leave the table, but I remained seated for a moment longer, watching the final phase of the reception unfold. Jason did not approach. It did not retreat. It simply remained positioned at a distance where observation and control of visibility were still possible. And in that controlled stillness, I finally understood that whatever had been introduced into this night was no longer hidden within action. It was embedded in expectation. The evening was not revealing something new. It was confirming something that had already been set in motion before I ever noticed it.